Welcome, everyone. Let's dive into an emotional story about a fateful encounter between a lonely millionaire and a homeless little girl. Can compassion alone be enough to change their lives? This is a journey of love, hope, and healing that you simply cannot miss. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss more meaningful stories to come. The city was a merciless canvas of gray. Snowflakes tumbled from an indifferent sky, dissolving on the cracked pavement where shadows stretched long and thin. New York in December held its cruel beauty, a juxtaposition of icy grandeur and human despair. The city never stopped, yet for James Harrington, time felt suspended as he hurried down Fifth Avenue. His tailored overcoat and polished leather shoes cut a sharp figure against the blurred chaos of pedestrians, yet beneath the veneer of power and success lay a hollowed man. James's world was a carefully constructed empire of stock market triumphs and endless board meetings. A man of wealth, influence, and routine, he never lingered long enough to notice the small cracks in the world around him. Until that morning. The bitter cold gnawed at his fingers as he shifted his briefcase to the other hand. Something caught his attention, a flicker of movement against the corner of a snow-laden bench. A girl, no older than 7 or 8, huddled against the wrought iron railings, her small frame wrapped in a tattered coat that did little to guard against the winter's bite. Her face was smudged, her blonde curls tangled, but her eyes, wide and impossibly blue, shone with a light that seemed both defiant and desperate. James hesitated. He had places to be, important meetings, calls to make, yet he found himself rooted to the spot. The girl noticed him, shrinking back instinctively, her hands clutching a crumpled paper bag. For a moment neither spoke, the city's roar a muted backdrop to the silent exchange. Then James stepped closer. "Hi," he said, his voice unexpectedly soft. "What's your name?" The girl's lips trembled, as though the answer might cost her something. Finally she whispered, "Lily, sir." Something broke in James then, a crack in the impenetrable wall he had spent decades fortifying. Compassion was a language he hadn't spoken in years, but here, in the bitter cold, it found him. "Come with me," he said, surprising even himself. "Let's get you somewhere warm." The penthouse seemed to shrink as James brought Lily inside. The warmth hit her first, making her shiver involuntarily. Her wary eyes scanned the pristine marble floors, the towering windows that framed the city's skyline, and the understated elegance of furniture that whispered wealth. "Sit down," James urged, motioning to the velvet armchair. "I'll get you something to eat." Lily hesitated but obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair as though afraid to disturb its perfection. James returned moments later with a plate of sandwiches and a steaming mug of cocoa. She stared at the food, her hunger battling with pride, before she began to eat in small, measured bites. James watched her in silence, his mind racing. Who was this child? Why was she alone on the streets in a storm like this? When she looked up, crumbs on her lips, he found himself asking the question he dreaded. "Where are your parents?" Lily's gaze dropped to her lap. Her voice was a ghost. "My dad left me here. He and my mom had a big fight. Then he just abandoned me." James felt the words lodge in his chest like jagged ice. "How long have you been out there?" "Since last week," she murmured. "I don't know where my mom is." Her words unraveled something deep within him, a knot of guilt he hadn't realized existed. James had spent years avoiding connections, building barriers so high that no one dared to climb them. Yet here was this small, fragile life, asking for nothing, and it shattered him. "You're not alone anymore, Lily," he said firmly. "I'm going to help you." Her eyes met his, tentative but hopeful. It was a look he hadn't seen in years, a belief in kindness. James felt an unfamiliar warmth rise within him. That night, James stood by the window, the city a sea of lights beneath him. His reflection stared back, a man whose fortune could buy everything but meaning. Lily was asleep in the guest room, wrapped in a blanket that dwarfed her small frame. He had never intended for this encounter to become more than a passing act of charity, but now it felt as though fate had other plans. The snow fell heavier, clinging to the window panes like whispers of another time. James's thoughts wandered to his own childhood, to memories of a father whose love was a cold, exacting thing. He had vowed to be nothing like the man who raised him, yet in many ways he had become an echo of that distant figure. He thought of Lily's face when she had said, "My dad left me." The words haunted him. He didn't know why, but he felt a connection to her, a tether that refused to be severed. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to feel, to hope. Morning came with the muted glow of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Lily was sitting at the kitchen counter when James walked in, her hair brushed and her face scrubbed clean. She smiled hesitantly, and he felt a flicker of pride at how quickly she seemed to adapt. "What do you like to eat for breakfast?" he asked. "Pancakes," she said, her voice stronger than the day before. "Pancakes it is." He rolled up his sleeves, pulling ingredients from the fridge. The sight of him in the kitchen was almost comical. James Harrington, the city's most calculated businessman, flipping pancakes for a homeless girl. Yet, it felt right. As they ate together, a strange sense of peace settled over them. Lily told him about her favorite books, the stray cat she had fed in the park, and her dream of one day owning a house with a big garden. James listened intently, his guarded heart beginning to thaw. When the meal was over, he cleared his throat. "Lily, do you remember where your mom might be?" She frowned, thinking hard. "Maybe in Brooklyn. We lived there before Dad left." James nodded. "Then we'll find her." The words came easily, yet they carried the weight of a promise. He didn't know what drove him, guilt, redemption, or something deeper, but he was determined to help Lily find her family. As he looked into her hopeful eyes, James realized that for the first time in years, he felt alive. A new chapter was beginning, and though he didn't know where it would lead, he was willing to follow it. The following day arrived with a sharp clarity, the kind that only comes after a sleepless night. James sat at the edge of his immaculate leather couch, his phone in hand, his mind a storm. The promise he made to Lily weighed heavily on him, not as a burden but as a strange, unfamiliar responsibility. He had told her he would find her mother, but now, faced with the reality of it, doubts crept in like shadows in the periphery of his thoughts. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, flipping through a children's book James had hastily purchased the night before. She hummed softly, her voice light but tinged with something fragile. She seemed so small, yet the resilience in her made James's chest tighten. He had once been resilient too, or so he thought. His childhood came flooding back in vivid flashes. The cold, impersonal halls of his father's estate, the stern commands, the silent dinners. His father had believed emotions were weaknesses to be eradicated. James had absorbed that lesson well, until now. Now, sitting across from Lily, he questioned everything. "James?" Lily's voice broke through his reverie, gentle but insistent. He looked up, startled. "Yes? Do you think she'll be happy to see me?" Her voice wavered, her small fingers fidgeting with the edge of the book. James leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Of course she will, Lily. She's your mother." Lily nodded, though doubt flickered in her eyes. The weight of abandonment had left its mark. James felt a pang of anger, not at Lily, not even at her mother, but at a world that could leave a child so uncertain of her own worth. We'll find her, he said, more to himself than to Lily. I'll make sure of it. The search took days. James used every resource at his disposal. Private investigators, public records, even his own contacts in City Hall. Each new lead brought a flicker of hope, only to be extinguished by another dead end. Lily's quiet optimism kept him going, though her eyes betrayed a nervous anticipation. Finally, the breakthrough came. A name, an address. Brooklyn. James drove them himself, navigating the icy streets with a focus that bordered on obsession. As they approached the address, an old tenement building that seemed to sag under the weight of its own history, James felt a strange tension coil in his chest. What if this didn't go the way he'd promised Lily? What if the woman they were about to find had truly abandoned her daughter? The air in the car was thick with unspoken fears. Lily clutched the stuffed bear James had given her, her knuckles white. "Is this it?" she whispered. "Yes," James replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "This is it." The apartment door was chipped and painted a dull green. James knocked, his fist firm against the wood. They waited. Each second stretched unbearably long until the sound of footsteps approached. The door creaked open to reveal a woman, thin, with tired eyes and hair that fell in disheveled ways. She looked older than her years, as though life had worn her down to the bone. Her gaze shifted from James to Lily, and in that instant the world seemed to stop. "Lily." The woman's voice was a broken whisper, disbelief mingling with something deeper. Regret, perhaps? "Mom?" Lily's voice was barely audible. The woman stepped forward, her hand trembling as it reached for her daughter. The distance between them seemed vast, yet unbearably close. When she knelt, pulling Lily into her arms, the floodgates opened. Lily cried openly, her small frame shaking as she clung to the woman who had seemed like a ghost until now. James stepped back, giving them space, though his own emotions churned violently. Relief, sadness, something unnameable. "I thought you were gone forever, Sarah," as James now knew her, whispered into Lily's hair. Lily pulled back slightly, her eyes wet but determined. "Why did you leave me, Mom?" The question hung in the air like a fragile thread. Sarah looked at James, then back at Lily, her face crumpling. "Oh, I didn't mean to," she said, her voice breaking. Your father, he promised he'd take care of you. I didn't know." Her words faltered and tears slid down her face. James felt an odd sense of protectiveness and toward both of them. But Sarah, he said gently, "Lily's safe now, but she needs you." Sarah's eyes met his, filled with a mix of guilt and gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice heavy. I didn't know how to find her, or if she'd even want to see me." "Of course she would," James replied, his tone firm. "She's your daughter." As they drove back to Manhattan, the car was quieter than before, but the silence felt less oppressive. Lily held her mother's hand tightly, as though afraid she might disappear again. James stole a glance at them in the rearview mirror, a strange warmth spreading in his chest. The world had shifted. He could feel it. Lily had found her mother, and yet, he realized, this was only the beginning. For all the answers they had uncovered, there were still questions that loomed, questions he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. But as Lily smiled, a small, hopeful smile that seemed to light up the dim car interior, James knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just an observer in this story. He was part of it now, whether he liked it or not. The apartment had grown warmer since Sarah moved in, not just from the added bodies, but from the subtle hum of connection that Lily's reunion brought. James watched from the kitchen as Lily and Sarah sat on the living room floor, piecing together a puzzle. Their quiet laughter echoed faintly, filling the once sterile space with life. For weeks, James had been acclimating to this new dynamic, watching the bond between mother and daughter rebuild brick by fragile brick. He should have felt a sense of completion, but unease lingered in the back of his mind like a shadow refusing to be dismissed. He couldn't explain it, but every time he looked at Lily, a nagging thought tightened its grip. That night, as the city's lights glowed faintly against the windows, Sarah approached him. She looked hesitant, her hands clutching the back of the chair as if steadying herself for an impact. "James, can we talk?" she asked, her voice low but firm. He glanced up from the document he'd been reading, instantly alert. The weight of her tone cut through him. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Sarah sat down across from him, her posture tense. Her eyes, which had grown softer in recent days, now brimmed with something raw and unspoken. For a moment, she couldn't meet his gaze. "Like, if you find this video helpful, it helps me a lot." "It's about Lily," she began, her voice faltering. "There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you from the start." James's brow furrowed. He leaned forward, his heart starting to race. "What is it, Sarah?" Her eyes met his then, wide and vulnerable, and he knew whatever she was about to say would change everything. "She's your daughter, James." The words hit him like a thunderclap, reverberating through his chest and scattering his thoughts. He stared at her, unblinking, trying to process what he'd just heard. "My... what?" he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lily is your daughter," Sarah repeated, her voice cracking under the weight of her confession. "I didn't know how to tell you before. I didn't even think I'd ever see you again, but it's true." James's breath caught, his chest tightening as an avalanche of emotions buried him. Shock, denial, anger, and beneath it all, something terrifyingly profound. A flicker of belonging he hadn't felt in years. It seemed, somewhere within the world within irrational minds, a place some soul quadrant was belonging. Didn't you tell me?" His voice was sharper than he intended, and Sarah flinched. "I thought I was protecting her," she said quickly, tears welling in her eyes. "Back then you were so distant, consumed by your work. And when you left, I didn't think you'd wanted anything to do with us. I didn't even know if you'd care." "Care?" James's voice broke, his frustration spilling out. "You didn't think I'd care that I had a daughter. Sarah, you took away years I'll never get back." Sarah's tears began to fall, but she held his gaze, her voice trembling with equal parts sorrow and determination. "You're right. I should have told you. But I'm telling you now, because Lily deserves the truth. She deserves you." James stood abruptly, his hands gripping the back of his chair as if it could anchor him. He turned toward the window, his reflection staring back at him, his face a mosaic of emotions. The city stretched below, oblivious to the storm raging within him. In the silence that followed, memories began to surface. The way Lily's laughter had filled the apartment, the way her smile made the room brighter, the uncanny familiarity in her eyes. He had chalked it up to coincidence, but now it all made sense. He turned back to Sarah, his voice quieter, steadier. "Does she know?" Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. I thought it should come from you." James's throat tightened. He had spent years running from emotional entanglements, choosing control over vulnerability. Yet here he was, faced with a truth so intimate it terrified him. Could he be the father Lily needed? Did he even deserve the chance? He heard soft footsteps and turned to see Lily standing in the doorway, Clutching her stuffed bear, her eyes flicked between them, sensing the tension in the air. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice small but brave. James knelt down, his heart pounding. He looked into her eyes, those same blue eyes that mirrored his own, and felt something inside him shift. "Lily," he began, his voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you." Her brow furrowed, curiosity and concern flickering across her face. "What is it?" He reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I didn't know this until now, but I'm your dad." Lily blinked, her small hand tightening in his. "You're my dad?" she echoed, as if trying the words on for size. James nodded, his throat thick with emotion. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm your dad, and I'm so sorry I didn't know sooner, but I promise you, I'm here now and I'm never going to leave." For a moment, Lily didn't say anything. Then, slowly, she smiled. A radiant, tear-filled smile that seemed to light up the entire room. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, her voice muffled but certain. "I always hoped you'd come." James held her tightly, his own tears falling freely now. In that moment, the walls he had built around himself crumbled, replaced by something far stronger: love. The night James decided to confront his father, the city seemed eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. Snow fell in soft whispers outside the towering skyscraper where his father's penthouse loomed, a stark monument to a legacy of control. James had not been here in years, the place standing like a fortress of memories he'd tried to bury. He stepped into the elevator, his reflection staring back at him in the polished chrome. The man he saw was no longer the dutiful son who had sought validation in his father's shadow. Yet the weight of his past clung to him like a chain, pulling him back into a world where love had been conditional and emotions were seen as liabilities. The doors slid open with a soft chime, and James stepped out, his footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. His father's study was exactly as he remembered: wood-paneled walls, shelves lined with leather-bound books, and a faint smell of cigar smoke that lingered like an uninvited ghost. Behind the massive desk sat Edward Harrington, a man whose presence filled the room with an air of silent judgment. Time had weathered his face, but the steely gaze remained as sharp as ever. "James," Edward said, his voice clipped and impassive, "I wasn't expecting you." James stood at the threshold, his hands clenched at his sides. "We need to talk." Edward raised an eyebrow, motioning for him to sit. "This sounds serious." James stayed standing. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to speak. "It is. I've spent my whole life trying to live up to your expectations, trying to be the man you wanted me to be. But it's time I say what I should have said years ago." Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Go on." For a moment, James faltered, memories crashing over him like a tidal wave. He saw himself as a boy, standing in this very room, his father's voice cold as ice. "Don't cry, James. Harrington men don't cry. Focus on what matters: success, strength, power." The words had shaped him, molded him into the unyielding man he'd become, and yet, standing here now, he realized how much they had taken from him. "You made me believe that love was a weakness," James said, his voice shaking but resolute, "that emotions had no place in success. But what you really did was teach me how to be afraid. Afraid of failure, afraid of connection, afraid of being human." Edward's eyes narrowed, his lips tightening into a thin line. "Everything I did was for your benefit, to make you strong. Look at what you've accomplished. You're one of the most successful men in the city." "And at what cost?" James countered, his voice rising. "I shut people out. I lost Sarah because I was too afraid to let her in. I didn't even know I had a daughter because I was too busy trying to be the man you wanted me to be. Do you have any idea how empty that feels?" The room seemed to close in around them, the silence between father and son stretching taut like a wire about to snap. Edward finally spoke, his tone softer than James had expected. "I wanted you to have what I didn't. My father, he was harder than I ever was on you. I thought if I pushed you, you'd rise above it." James shook his head, his voice heavy with both anger and sorrow. "You didn't push me to rise above anything. You pushed me to become a mirror of you. But I'm done living like that. I'm done carrying your expectations." Edward looked away, his usually impassive face betraying a flicker of vulnerability. "And what do you plan to do now?" James straightened, his voice steady and clear. "I'm going to be the father Lily needs. I'm going to teach her that love isn't a weakness, but the strongest thing we have. And I'm going to live my life on my terms, not yours." Edward sat in silence for a long moment, his gaze fixed on a photograph on his desk, a younger version of himself holding a wide-eyed James on his knee. The contrast was striking. In the picture, they seemed like a family united. In reality, they had been fractured, their bond one of obligation, not love. "I see her in you," Edward said finally, his voice quiet. "Lily. She's your chance to do things differently." James nodded, the tension in his chest easing for the first time in years. "She is, and I won't waste it." As he turned to leave, James felt a strange lightness, as though a weight he'd carried for decades had been lifted. The confrontation had not healed everything, but it had severed the chains that bound him to a past he no longer wanted to define him. Stepping out into the cold night air, James looked up at the city skyline. The snow had stopped, and the stars were faint but visible, like tiny beacons of hope. He thought of Lily waiting for him at home, her laughter filling the apartment, her trust in him unshakable. For the first time, he felt free, not just from his father's expectations, but from his own fear of connection. James took a deep breath, his path forward clear. He would not let the past dictate his future. Lily deserved a father who could love unconditionally, and for her, he would become that man. The dawn broke softly, spilling golden light over the sprawling estate James had chosen as their new home. It was a far cry from the cold, impersonal luxury of his penthouse in Manhattan. This house, nestled in the gentle hills of upstate New York, brimmed with warmth and life, a place where laughter could echo freely and the past could loosen its grip. James stood on the wraparound porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The crisp air carried the faint scent of pine, mingling with the morning dew. He gazed out at the landscape, where Lily played in the yard with Sarah, her giggles a melody that danced on the wind. A year ago, he couldn't have imagined this moment, this peace, this completeness. Now, it felt as though he had always been heading here, even if the journey had been circuitous and painful. Inside, the house was alive with color and personal touches. Lily's drawings adorned the refrigerator, their bright, messy lines a stark contrast to the sterile art James used to collect. Books filled mismatched shelves, their spines well-worn from frequent reading. A vase of fresh flowers sat on the dining table, their soft petals catching the morning light. James stepped inside and paused at the threshold of the kitchen. Sarah was busy making breakfast, her movements graceful yet purposeful. She glanced up and smiled when she saw him, the kind of smile that felt like coming home. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm and steady. "Did you sleep well?" James nodded, setting his coffee down on the counter. "Better than I have in years." Sarah turned back to the stove, her hair catching the sunlight. "You look like a man who's finally found what he's been searching for." James leaned against the counter, watching her. "I think I have." Her smile widened, but she didn't say anything more. Some things didn't need words. Later that afternoon, James found Lily in the garden, crouched beside a patch of wildflowers. She looked up as he approached, her face lit with excitement. "Dad, look at this!" she exclaimed, holding up a small butterfly that had landed on her finger. Its delicate wings shimmered in the sunlight, a vivid burst of color against her tiny hand. James knelt beside her, marveling at the sight. "It's beautiful, Lily, just like you." She beamed, and James felt his chest tighten with love. He reached out, gently cupping her hand so they could watch the butterfly together. "You know," he said softly, "when I was your age, I used to chase butterflies too, but I never caught one as special as this." Lily giggled, her laughter infectious. "Maybe it's because you didn't know where to look." James chuckled, ruffling her hair. "You're probably right. You're much smarter than I was at your age." She looked up at him, her expression suddenly serious. "Do you think the butterfly was lost? Like me?" James's heart clenched, but he met her gaze with unwavering tenderness. "Maybe it was, but sometimes being lost helps us find something even better, just like how I found you." Lily considered this for a moment, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. She let the butterfly go, watching it flutter away into the open sky. "Do you think it's happy now?" she asked. "I think it's free," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And I think that's the happiest anyone can be." That evening, the family gathered around the fireplace, the room bathed in a warm, golden glow. Lily sat curled up between James and Sarah, her head resting on James's shoulder. He held her close, his hand gently stroking her hair as she flipped through a picture book. Sarah looked over at them, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're a natural, you know," she said softly. James glanced at her, surprised. "A natural at what?" "Being a father," she replied, her voice tinged with admiration. "You've given her something I thought she'd never have, a real family." James's throat tightened, but he managed a small smile. "She's given me just as much, maybe more." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the crackling fire their only companion. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying away the remnants of a storm that had long since passed. As the days turned into weeks, James found himself changing in ways he hadn't thought possible. He laughed more, worried less. He learned how to bake cookies with Lily, though his first attempt ended in flour covering the entire kitchen. He spent hours building a treehouse with her, his hands blistered but his heart full. He even began writing letters to his father, not to reopen old wounds, but to share the healing he had found. The house itself seemed to transform along with them. What once felt like a shell became a sanctuary, filled with memories in the making. James often caught himself standing in the middle of a room, marveling at how far he'd come. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, James stood on the porch with Sarah. They watched Lily chase fireflies in the yard, her laughter ringing out like a bell. "You've changed, you know," Sarah said, breaking the comfortable silence. James turned to her, his expression contemplative. "I had to. For her. For myself." Sarah reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You didn't just change, James. You found yourself, and in doing that, you gave Lily something priceless, a father who truly loves her." James looked down at their intertwined hands, then back at Sarah. "And you," he said, his voice low but steady. "You gave me the courage to face everything I was too afraid to. I couldn't have done this without you." Sarah smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "We did this together, all of us. As the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, James felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had brought him here, to this moment, to this family, to this life he never thought he deserved. He pulled Sarah into a gentle embrace, their silhouettes framed by the soft glow of the porch light. In the yard, Lily ran toward them, her arms outstretched, her laughter bright and unrestrained. James crouched down, catching her in a hug that seemed to hold the world itself. "We're a family now," Lily said, her voice muffled against his chest. James smiled, his heart fuller than he ever thought possible. "Yes, sweetheart, we're a family, and nothing will ever change that." As the three of them stood together under the endless sky, James realized that this wasn't just a new beginning. It was a life reborn, filled with love, hope, and the courage to move forward together.